Again, just to remind ourselves of the contrast that exists between Judges and Ruth, because Judges is a very big picture story about the very leadership and legacy and destiny of the people of Israel. Their failings, the salacious behavior, all absolute drama fest. There's violence and murder and death, and it's just this brutal book. On the other hand, you have Ruth, which is no less integral to the legacy and history of Israel. It's very big picture in a way, but yet it just focuses in on this very small family. It focuses in on very interpersonal relationships. It doesn't have any of the terror or seeming grand scope of armies and war, but it still is just as critical, just as necessary for the existence of Israel and the existence of our faith. So it's a very special book, and as we've already seen, lots of very interesting drama just to get us a little bit up to speed. We were introduced to a woman who rose out of tragedy, and yet with dignity, loyalty, and compassion by the name of Ruth, who meets a man who is noble, hardworking, perfect man to rescue her from the desperate situation of having lost her husband and at risk of losing an inheritance. The problem is, as much as it seems like when you get to the end of chapter 3, this is a match made in heaven, this is the providence of God, they're perfect to each other. You could think of no better two people in all of Bethlehem than Ruth and Boaz. There's drama. There's still a story to be told here. There's still got to be some conflict. Again, if you were filming, like I think Judges and Ruth, they make for good stories in terms of if you wanted to turn it into a TV show or movie or something like that. Well, there's got to be a little bit more drama. You got to have a little bit more excitement in it, and it stems from the integrity of both Ruth and Boaz, but more so of Boaz, because Boaz's opportunity to what we call redeem Ruth and Naomi, her mother-in-law, and the land that is owed to them, it has to come to the closest relative first. So that introduces the drama that we left Ruth 3 with. Now, just to refresh ourselves again, this idea of redemption, what are we talking about? We're going to talk about, in my Bible, it says Boaz redeems Ruth. What does that entail? That's kind of a weird verbiage. You don't say that kind of thing anymore, right? When's the last time you redeemed someone? I redeem coupons. You get your cash redemption value from recycling cans. How do you redeem a person? Well, the concept of redemption is, in a way, God's social contract. It was the way that God preserved, had a safety net, you could say, for society. They didn't have Social Security or anything like that, but in God's providence and kindness, He gave a plan for the Israelites for how they could be redeemed when you got into a bad spot. Now, we won't go to the passages. We will refer to it later a little bit more. But remember that the Bible is not just like a book of stories and prophecies and like Psalms and Song of Solomon. The Bible, especially in the beginning, is the founding story and founding documents of the whole nation of Israel. So in the first 5 books in particular, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, it's both history and law, and there's multiple books that amount to like the Constitution and the law codes that govern the nation of Israel, as well as the story of how they became a nation. That's all wrapped up together in Genesis through Deuteronomy. And part of that law included laws regarding property and inheritance that you could have lost because you were impoverished, bankrupt. You had to sell your land. Well, that was entitled to you in a sense. God gave this land to the tribes, and you had this lot of land. But if you came to some poverty or someone had died, that land, which was yours, would sometimes have to be sold. And because Israel was tribally and family-oriented, if a family member did go into bankruptcy or owe money or anything like that, or lose a husband without having any children, the nearest family member could redeem that victimized other family member. So that could include paying off debts to keep the inheritance in the family or the property in the family. Or in the case of a widow, that could even mean that the brother of the man who died could marry the widow, and their first child would be considered as if the firstborn son of the dead husband. And that was called levirate marriage. Levir is the Hebrew word for husband's brother. So this was a law in order to perpetuate and to maintain the name of this man who died. God wanted to make sure that every person was cared for in Israel. And if they had done it God's way, really there shouldn't have been a lot of poverty or injustice or anything like that if they could do it God's way. But unfortunately, of course, they didn't. Now, what Boaz was offering to Ruth was precisely to marry Ruth, pay any debts, and reclaim all the possession and property that was previously in the name of Ruth's dead husband, who at that point, since all the men had died, it was just there and it needed to be redeemed or claimed by someone who would be willing to marry into that family. Now, the catch was, as I said earlier, that this redemption needed to stay as close to the family as possible. And there was a man who was closer to the family than Boaz. And Boaz's integrity, remember, he's an honest man. He wasn't going to try and skirt around this obligation or this duty. He knew he needed to notify this guy to the opportunity that was here. Now, what is interesting, just real fast, is that the Levirate law, it only talks about the brother of the man who died, if he's sonless. So if you're single, your brother dies without any kids, is married, you had sort of an obligation. Now, this is a totally weird way of thinking, that you would marry that widow, and your first son would be like your brother's son, and you'd perpetuate his name. Again, this is how they made sure God was making sure everyone's taken care of. But this doesn't sound like you extend it to like all the relatives, right? Like cousins and anything like that. So some commentators point out, well, why Boaz is not like the brother of Ruth's husband or anything. He's just some kind of relative. But it seems that either the idea of extending it beyond just like the blood brother was something that the culturally developed, like a local custom. Or what's probably more likely is that they understood God was laying down like a principle. Like literally the brother ought to do it. And if you remember, if the consequence, if the brother refused to give children in his dead brother's name, that widow could take the guy's sandal off, spit in his face, and everyone would call him Mr. No Sandal. That was literally Deuteronomy 25, 7 through 10. That's what would happen. That's because there's a shame involved in you not being willing to perpetuate. I mean, you're killing your brother's bloodline. It's kind of the way it's looking at. So it seems like really what happened was there was an understanding that the spirit of that law was that someone in the family, as close as possible, would perpetuate that dead person's family. So maybe it seems consistent to me, but technically Deuteronomy doesn't say anything about like other relatives. But in any case, Boaz's own sense, at least, of moral uprightness, if not the literal law, was that someone closer to the family and not some more distant relative ought to be the Redeemer, or at least given that opportunity. So that's where we come to Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." So Naomi was married to Elimelech. They're the parents of Ruth's dead husband. "So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you'll redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, I'll redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, Boaz goes up to the gate. And you have to understand that in that culture, most cities had a wall protecting it. And the gates are where there was a lot of transactions and commerce, obviously, because that's where people come in. So you'd come in from the field, or travelers would come in with their goods, and merchants. So there's a lot of flow of traffic there. And the gate, in most of these like ancient Near Eastern cities, the gate is where stuff happened. That's where you hung out. That's where you got the gossip. And you'd oftentimes have elders or other venerable city leaders at the gate, and you would settle even civic disputes there. So if you had beef with your neighbor, you'd say, all right, let's go to the gate. We're going to talk to the judge, lay our case there, and he's going to judge between us. So the gate is where everything happens. So it's a very public area, and it was notable for being a place of transactions, judgments, witnesses, so on. So there's a issue here that Boaz wants to make sure is very public. You also have to understand they didn't have cameras then. They didn't have reporters then. It's not really, back then they're using stone tablets and things, so record keeping, a lot of it you would do by testimony. So he gathers 10 elders there with this man who happens to come by, and he catches this potential redeemer there at the gate, and then these witnesses, in order to have this be very public and well known. Boaz is deliberate, he's thoughtful, he wanted this, he had a plan, Ruth was worth it, so here's the plan. Now what's funny is, you don't quite get this in English, but when he says turn aside friend, the word for friend there is, in Hebrew, it's paloni almoni. And it rhymes for a reason, because it's like the Hebrew equivalent of Mr. So-and-so. Right? It's almost certain that Boaz knew this guy's name. He wasn't just come Paloni Almoni. It's literally, it's like some guy from somewhere. So Mr. So-and-so. We're going to call him Mr. So-and-so. Now, does he have a name? Yes. Did Boaz use his name? Certainly. But the writer of the book of Ruth, which is probably Samuel, the last judge, he's editing it out. Why? Why is he editing it out, Mr. So-and-so's name here? Well, it's because this guy deserves a little bit of shame and scorn. Because while we know it was God's plan for Boaz to be the redeemer, Mr. So-and-so not only despises the opportunity to be a redeemer to someone in his family, and for selfish reasons, we'll find out, this guy also missed out on marrying one of the most virtuous women in the Bible. This guy screwed up. This guy deserves a lot of mockery and shame, because he could have been, in the lineage. Now, this is, it happened the way it was going to happen, but we know that this union between Ruth and Boaz is going to produce David. So the guy, if you think of it that way, he missed out on being in the line of Jesus and King David. So this guy gets no name. He's Mr. So-and-so. Matthew Henry says, because he refused to raise up the name of the dead, he deserved not to have his name preserved to future ages in this history. So he blew it big time. Even if it was just the opportunity to marry Ruth, again, just this wonderful woman, he screwed that one up. So he doesn't even get a name. Anyway, he's willing to buy back the property of Elimelech, because hey, just like now, more real estate, yeah, sure, it's valuable. It's valuable then, it's valuable now. But Boaz, of course, has another card up his sleeve. Now, commentators like to read into these things like we do too. Like, was Boaz like, oh no, he's going to redeem it. Like, I'm going to lose Ruth. Or did he know already, this guy's not going to want to marry her. He's not going to want to add this. So in other words, was he confident in this plan he had? Because he doesn't mention Ruth right away, like that was like a trump card. Or was he afraid? Oh no, like I could potentially lose the possibility to be with Ruth. I don't know. We'll ask Boaz in heaven when we get there. But in terms of drama, it's dramatic, right? Like you're like, oh no, he's going to get Ruth. He's going to get this field and everything. And then Boaz pulls out this card. Well, Also with the field comes this woman. Now, this is not as good of a deal in terms of Mr. So-and-so, because it would impair his own inheritance. What does that mean? It refers to the fact that he would be having to spend money to buy this field, which would go to the firstborn son he has with Ruth, who would be considered as like the son of Ruth and her husband who died, Malone, right? So he's going to buy a field, not for himself or his kids, but for a kid that's going to be considered of a totally, different bloodline. Does that make sense? So it's like, no, this is not as good a deal now because I'm going to buy it. It's not even going to go into my family. It's going to go into the family of Ruth and Malone. So that just takes away from any inheritance I want to give to my kids, present or future. So he declines it. Mr. So-and-so declines it. He does offer the opportunity to Boaz, and Boaz, he immediately takes the offer. Verse 7. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you're witnesses this day that I've bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Malone. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Malone, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. The comment here, after Boaz immediately invokes the right to redeem, the comment in verse 7 says, now this was the custom in former times in Israel. That tells you that this was written, of course, sometime after the time of Ruth. Likely, again, this is Samuel who's writing this account and the account of Judges. Samuel was probably the author, compiler, editor. And this would have been potentially hundreds of years after the events, but they kept records of these things, obviously, the genealogy and everything. So Samuel's likely the one, but just know that this was written after the fact. Now this practice of confirming the transaction with the sandal swap, that's not anywhere in the Bible. This is not the same thing as I mentioned earlier when if you refuse to take your dead brother's wife, that the wife would take your sandal and spit in your face and call you Mr. No Sandal. Again, that's Deuteronomy 25, 7 through 10. This is not that same practice. They're similar though. But I don't think that's intentional. I think it is intended to give us like an ironic little picture. Because really what should have happened is, if this was like the Levirate marriage thing, that Ruth should have came up at that moment and done that, right? And it would have been to shame him. Actually, his whole house was going to be called the house of Mr. No Sandal. So from Mr. So-and-so to Mr. No Sandal. But as it turns out, this was just a sign of a deal. This is how you close a deal. Like, it's sort of odd, but the practice like spitting your hand and like, sealing a deal that way, that's kind of weird too. But it's kind of like that idea, just like a little ritual they did to signify a transaction that's being made. And you can think of it this way. Boaz ends up taking the sandal from Mr. So-and-so, so that so-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, could avoid the shame of having his sandal taken from him. In other words, like Boaz is sparing this man from the shame of not redeeming his kinsman. And in that sense, Boaz makes up for Mr. So-and-so's failure, as well as redeeming Ruth and the land. I just find that interesting because like when, of course, this is all a picture of what Christ has done, that he's our Redeemer. And there's a sense in which we can't even redeem ourselves. We can't even do the right thing to redeem others. Jesus Christ has to do that for us. Like he takes the shame of the fact that we don't even want to do the right thing. We don't even want to redeem in those circumstances. So anyway, I just, that little picture there about the sandal is interesting. I don't think it's not like there's a contradiction between, oh no, Ruth was supposed to take the sandal. It's not that. It's just the practice were similar, but it gives a little insight. Anyway, that's not the only thing that happens at these gates. I get a kick out of what happens next. So, verse 11, then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that Yahweh will give you by this young woman. It all of a sudden went from being something where it's just like Boaz and Mr. So-and-so and the 10 elders to everybody at the gate, is in on this. Oh, we'll all be witnesses too. It just, again, there's a very public place, but it's like gossip central, and they get to be at the center of it. But this is good gossip. Good gossip meaning that everyone is praising and blessing Ruth and Boaz. Like their reputation was so well known that even the bunch of random people there at the gate, there's no better people to get married than Ruth and Boaz. This is obviously the work of God. They're praising God. What a joyous thing it is when two people who know and love the Lord come together. It's a huge source of rejoicing, is sort of what Bruce was talking about in Heidi and Stanton's wedding. I mean, it was just like that kind of situation where you see God's hand move. You see two quality people come together, and you're just a random person there, but their reputation is so well known that everyone stops to praise God and to affirm that this is good and glorious and great. So I appreciate this little scene, everyone being so excited for Boaz and Ruth. It's such a contrast, again, to the gloom and the terror of the book of Judges. There's going to be a wedding, and everyone loves a wedding, especially Hebrew weddings, because they went on for days. And they just partied and ate and drank for days when there was a wedding. So they're getting excited. Again, clearly their reputations were known. It's a match made in heaven, literally. And they reference some names here. They might be unfamiliar to you: Perez, Tamar, Judah, Rachel, Leah. Well, Rachel and Leah, they are the wives of Isaac and Jacob. It's no, I'm sorry, not Isaac, Jacob, right? So Jacob's wives are referenced here, who of course are the mothers of the tribes of Israel. So that's a very high praise to say, you're like one of the wives of the patriarchs. May your house be this rich and blessed. And then who are Perez, Tamar, and Judah? Here, I'll read a note from the NET Bible, which just says it very succinctly. I wasn't going to say it better than this. Perez is an appropriate comparison here because A, he was an ancestor of Boaz. B, he was born to Tamar by a surrogate father, Judah, after the death of her husband and refusal of the oldest brother to carry out the role of levirate marriage. So Perez is appropriate because he's born from a person who was doing the levirate marriage thing, and the closest brother was unwilling to do it. So it's just the same situation. And also that he had an unbroken line of male descendants extending over several generations. So this is a line that was very well known. Of course, the line of Judah is the kingly line of Israel. The king would come from the line of Judah. And now they were a part of this lineage that included another levirate marriage. And now here's another one that extends to David, and then beyond David to Jesus Christ. So it's a part of this history and legacy. And notice that Boaz is unashamed to call Ruth the Moabite and a widow. To say both of those things was kind of shameful, To be a widow was almost like you must have done something wrong or screwed up for your husband to die. And of course, being a Moabite, she is someone outside of the people of Israel. She should be condemned as an outsider. But Boaz had no problem accepting her. Despite being a Moabite, despite being a widow, you can tell that he had no qualms about fulfilling this duty and this honor to perpetuate the name of the dead husband. He had nothing but integrity and honor. He had nothing but compassion and love in his heart when he did this. It's such an amazing testament and testimony that he was absolutely willing to do all that the Lord had required of him, and it was all of joy, and it was all of happiness, all of acceptance. And everyone else saw that. They're all celebrating. They're all happy. There is another word there that bears note. It says, because of the offspring that Yahweh will give you by this young woman. Now, the word offspring in Hebrew is seed, is the word for seed, zarah. It may not be intentionally prophetic what this crowd is cheering, but maybe it is. The idea of a seed follows the narrative of Scripture all the way until Jesus. Genesis 3, Eve is told that her seed, is singular, would destroy the works of the devil, the serpent. And then in Genesis 12, 15, 17, Abraham is told that by his seed, singular, would all the nations of the earth be blessed. And then you read in Galatians that Jesus is the fulfillment of this seed promise. And here, even the people, maybe intentionally, maybe just providence of God, they also say that your house will be blessed and you'll have this offspring, this seed that Yahweh will give to you. And we know short term, we're going to be talking about David. That's what the end of this book points to. But we know that in David, we see a picture, a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, the ultimate son of David. Well, verse 13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. They got married. Arnold Fruchtenbaum points out, the 10 years in Moab brought misery, but the few short weeks in Bethlehem brought forth blessing. Ruth's social progression was now complete. First, she was a foreigner. Second, she was lower than the lowest servant. Third, she was upgraded to a maidservant in Ruth 3:9. Now, fourth, she became a wife. Here she went from all around the social strata in just a couple short years. She came to this place where God had turned everything upside down. I mean, you just don't know what tomorrow will bring. You might be low right now. Maybe it's been a year. Maybe it's been 2. Maybe it's been a few. But you just don't know what God's timing is, where everything can just be turned upside down, where what you thought was only misery in front of you can turn into joy. And so it was that Ruth was rewarded for her faithfulness. He went into her, and Yahweh gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be Yahweh, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Naomi, or Ruth and Boaz have a son. It's called a gift from Yahweh, who gave her conception, meaning every child is a gift. You're not owed children. No one's owed children. Every time a child comes into this world, it's a gift from God. It's a stewardship. Child doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the Lord. He gives it. And so there's a gift here, and they take it that way, of a child. And Naomi, who started our story, is now remembered again at the end of it. Naomi, who lost her husband and then her 2 sons. Naomi, who thought she was totally alone, but was faithfully followed by Ruth. Naomi, who at first thought her life was bitter, Marah. When she came back to her hometown of Bethlehem, basically said, don't talk to me. Yahweh has testified against me, brought calamity against me. Now everything, again, has been turned upside down. Where there was pain and suffering, now she has been restored. Praise is given to Yahweh for all of his blessings to her. Now, Obed here, the child, is not only Ruth's child, but Naomi's as well, since she's lost her sons. Yes, it's her grandson, but by extension, it's like her son as well. This isn't to diminish Boaz's role as the redeemer, but Obed here is who Naomi is calling a redeemer. And it's because Obed is the one who's going to actually carry the legacy of her son, Mahlon, and to a certain degree, Kilian, the other son. The child is or was God's provision to Naomi for redemption, for provision and redemption in her old age. It's just a stunning story. I mean, Naomi left Bethlehem for Moab because of a famine. She had nothing. And then just when things might have seemed to be going well in Moab, her husband dies and her sons die, and she had to return to Bethlehem with nothing. She wanted to change her name. She wanted to make her identity about the fact that she has been rejected and she has nothing. But in just a matter of about a year, everything changed. Her life is richer now than it was before. I mean, just the statement that Naomi is worth 7 sons, that's a tremendous statement. Yes, this is kind of a male-oriented society back then. Your worth might have been in the strength of your sons, so to say then that Naomi was worth 7 sons is to say that she was even richer than when she had 2 boys, that her inheritance and her household was even more profound because of Ruth. They say Naomi, Ruth, was worth 7 sons. She becomes like a nurse to Obed, and the verb nurse actually means firm, providing stability and confidence. Not like a wet nurse, but a nurturing person. Naomi, I'm sure, became an amazing grandmother. And if the perfect closing picture for Ruth and Boaz is their wedding, the perfect closing picture for Ruth is her cuddling her little grandson, Obed. And the book ends with the genealogy. These are the generations of Perez. Again, Perez was the product of a Levirate marriage. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. The book ends pointing to a king. Remember, Judges ended with, in those days, there's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Ruth is the opposite, where everyone did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. At least Boaz and Naomi, the main characters of it. Boaz and Ruth. I keep saying Naomi, but Boaz and Ruth. They did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. And guess what happened when those two did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh? A king. A king would come. There would be a king in Israel. What are some things we can learn? Well, just a few applications as we close out Ruth. Boaz stepped up when Mr. So-and-so failed to do what he ought to do. I just thought that was an interesting insight. Jesus also was tempted in every way as us, but without sin. So if Mr. So-and-so represents a man who has opportunities to do the right thing and fails to do them, just like we do, Boaz represents a man who could not help but do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, no matter what. He, Jesus, accomplishes a salvation for us that we cannot do for ourselves because he is this perfect man. And so Boaz is a picture of Christ as he perfectly does because of his integrity and righteousness, the right thing. Boaz, of course, was the kinsman redeemer as well. He paid the price that neither Ruth nor Naomi could pay. Jesus also pays for the price of our sin. Our sin makes us indebted. There's a judgment that must come. There's a cost to sinning. No one gets to sin and there is not some consequence. And the consequences of sin is death and judgment. But Jesus in his love, according to Ephesians 1:7, he redeemed us by paying blood. Boaz redeemed the field with money. He redeemed the bloodline by marrying Ruth, Jesus redeems us by dying on the cross for our sins and shedding his precious blood. Ruth, what can we learn from Ruth? Ruth was loyal and faithful to her mother Naomi, and by doing so, her mother-in-law Naomi, in doing so, demonstrated great faithfulness to the Lord. This points us to Jesus as well, because Jesus is faithful to those of the household of God. Hebrews 3:6 reminds us. We also saw last time that Ruth was, I'll put it like this, aggressively submissive. Right? We remember talking about that, how in following Naomi's plan to essentially ask Boaz to marry her in a culture where, frankly, the woman was to be submissive, she did aggressively submit to the Lord's plan ultimately. And of course, Jesus himself aggressively submitted to God. There's nothing shameful in submission, or else there's something shameful in what Christ did. Multiple times in the Gospels, it says that Jesus submitted to the will of the Father. I do what the will of the Father is. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus aggressively submitted to God. And so we see a great example of Christ-likeness in Ruth as well. And then lastly, Boaz and Ruth, they exemplify what every marriage should exemplify, the mystery and glory of Christ, the kinsman redeemer, being united to his bride, the church, for whom he suffered and died. Every marriage is to be a picture of Christ. Everyone, it just struck me. There are like 2 billion, something like 2.5 billion people that are married on the face of the planet, I think right now. And of course, there's billions of people who've been married. Think about it, billions of people have been married. And God intends that every one of those marriages glorify him. And they do. They do show in some way. It doesn't matter how secular you are, if you had a completely pagan, wedding or anything like that, still, you cannot get away from God being the one who gifted us with marriage, and whether you like it or not, that whenever a man and woman came together, they were testifying to the gospel. Every 2.5 billion of them are testifying. Every time they got married, it was testifying to the love of Christ and his church, whether they acknowledge that or not. And it's this tremendous idea that the love of God is woven into our being. Every society and culture has marriage. So we have a testimony in every society and culture that the reason for this and what is behind it is the very love of God himself. Now, if you are a Christian this afternoon, I hope that you're encouraged by the story of Ruth and Boaz, and that something in it might have struck your heart. Again, I just think it's really, there's a few things that just made me laugh here, is Mr. So-and-so and those witnesses that everyone's saying, yeah, this is, like we'll testify, we'll be witnesses. Like Boaz just pulled 10 guys, but everybody is so enthusiastic and happy. Oh yeah, we'll be witnesses too, because you guys, we know your reputation, we know your heart. This is wonderful. I just love that picture there. So hopefully something here was of encouragement to you, if you're not a Christian, this afternoon, to realize that God is showing you a love in this way. I think sometimes it's weird maybe for guys to think like, I'm the bride of Christ, and maybe that's like a weird, like not masculine thought to think I'm the bride of Christ collectively. But I think we can understand that I want to be loved and cared for. Doesn't matter, male or female. We want to be loved and cared for. We want our needs met. We want to be seen and understood. Well, God is very much the God of love who wants to do those things, who wants to love and care for you. If you're not a Christian, the only problem is so often we reject that love. So often we want to do things our own way. So often we think we have our own ideas about what would make us fulfilled and happy. And if you're married, you would know that it doesn't work if both are pursuing their own egos, their own plans, their own purposes. A marriage doesn't work like that. It'll be very short-lived. Well, so it is that if you want to know and understand the love of God, you can't do that while simultaneously pursuing your own way, your own purpose. You must turn to him. You must embrace his care for you. You must aggressively submit to what he has for you. If you have any questions about that, what that means, about what sin is, or how it is that God can love you even though you have run away from him, I'd love to talk to you about it. But I do pray that you would see here in this picture of Ruth and Boaz the great love of God for us.